Hello, I'm Mr. Johnston, and this is Biology. Welcome to section 1.8, the evolution of life. On this section, we're going to focus on kind of just the basics of what evolution is, what evidence is in basic terms, we'll get more into this in later chapters, we have for arriving at the idea of evolution, and just kind of some of the mechanisms and an overall time frame of what's happened, when, and why. So beginning, we've got to make sure we understand what the term evolution is actually referring to. And so once again, that's just going to talk about the idea of change over time. So when you're talking about evolution, we're talking about the change specifically in genes or gene frequencies, where genes become more common, they can become less common. You can have mutations that give rise to new genes that weren't present before, that allow for new characteristics, new possibilities. And this is going to focus once again, too, to make sure you remember, on multiple generations. So individuals are not going to evolve. This is going to be where in between generations, so from kind of the parents to the offspring to the grandchildren, if you will, you're going to see that over those shifts that you have certain genes become more common, or in some cases they can arise through mutation and they can just kind of pop up. And so you have this new trait that didn't exist with the previous generation. But the individuals over your lifespan, you don't evolve. When you evolve, it's over generations, and we'll be talking about populations or groups that evolve, not individuals anyway. Now, the big thing that kind of started the whole evolution idea, the whole background that led to evolution, is going to be the discovery of fossils. And fossils allowed us to kind of analyze some of these organisms, the primary one of which was pretty much dinosaur fossils. But there were a bunch of other extinct things that were much simpler, like ammonites, trilobites. There's more recent stuff we had, like saber-toothed tigers and mammoths. And so they started to get this general picture of stuff that was extinct. And then they started to come up with methods of dating them, which there's many, many different ways, over 20 different ways to try to date fossils. But in general, we're going to focus and just kind of, hopefully for now, let it go, that we're able to radioactively, for most of our samples, determine how old they are, and that there are other methods to verify this. So these are not dates we've pulled out of a hat. These are dates that many, many different ways of dating have all agreed upon as to how old they are. So as we got these fossils and we got methods of being able to figure out where they fit in chronologically into our big picture of life, and in general too, the big picture of Earth, we're able to kind of go through and sort out exactly where stuff belongs. And so we can start out and go back for our purposes, because the universe, some might see people talk about that. But for that one, you have to talk about the Big Bang Theory, which is physics. It's outside of biology's realm for our purposes. So if someone mentions 14 billion years ago, or BY they might read it as, that's not talking about biology. If we're talking about biology, we're going to focus on pretty much when Earth got here. And so around 4.5 billion years ago, give or take a little bit, it's okay if you're off by 100 million years. When you're talking about these big numbers, those aren't significant. But around 4.5 billion years ago or so, we got the Earth. And then for a while there, it looks like the Earth was a pretty inhospitable place. There wasn't oxygen, you've got meteors hitting it, you've got high temperatures. It was not very friendly for life. So there's kind of a gap where we don't really see much. But around 4 billion years ago, we start to see the first rocks that we can date that seem to show that the Earth was at least stable enough that some of the stuff that was there, the rocks, have made it till today intact. There's lots of stuff that can destroy rocks, weathering by water and wind. You can also have subduction, whereas plates, like the crust of the Earth, the rocky mass, can get kind of pushed down into the magma or the mantle where it's that liquid molten rock and can melt it. So we had something that was stable enough that some rocks have survived for 4 billion years. So that kind of gives you an idea of how they came up with about 4.5 or so, that there is kind of a rationale here. And if we look at these rocks, we can also see at about 3.5, give or take a bit, billion years ago, we start to see actual life. So we start to have actual fossils that show us life. So we know that fossils form relatively infrequently, especially if they're fossils of something small. And so by looking at this 3.5 billion year ago figure, this is how scientists can come up with the idea that life probably came about somewhere around 4 billion years ago, because we're adding on time to allow for there to be enough cells, to allow for there to be the right conditions, to allow for fossilization to occur of something that very, very, very rarely fossilizes. And so when you see the roughly 4, it might be 3.8, whatever, when you see those numbers, that's where they come from. And once again, it's okay if they're off by a bit. We're not tied to that number, it's not critical, but it gives us a sense of where to start the story of life. Now from there, you'll see that we have quite a while that passes where we've got prokaryotes, which are very simple cells. They have no membrane-bound organelles, they have no nuclei, but they are capable of a lot of cool stuff. They are very diverse. They just don't have like the compartments, if you will, inside the cell. There's not these membranes to separate it, and each individual prokaryote tends to be simpler. And so as we go through, we'll see that we start to get where oxygen forms, so it appears that photosynthesis evolved, which gives off oxygen. And so somewhere around, and it varies based upon, but somewhere at 2 point something billion years ago, we seem to have oxygen in the atmosphere. And so this is kind of a cool thing where you can see that there's these iron bands where oxygen was being absorbed by iron to make rust and then laying down in a lot of like the sediment. And so we can see that the oxygen that was first produced by photosynthesis didn't stick around. But eventually it overcame all this iron sitting around and made all that rust until there wasn't enough iron to absorb it. And so now we have an atmosphere with oxygen. So what we would start to think of as being slightly like our atmosphere. There wasn't near enough oxygen to be like ours, but it at least was something. And so from there we start to see around 2, sometimes they'll say 2.5 billion years ago, we start to get eukaryotes. So these are cells like ours that have nuclei, that have membrane-bound organelles. They're more complex. That doesn't always mean better. Once again, prokaryotes can do everything that eukaryotes can do in general and more. It's just one single prokaryotic cell can do less than one single eukaryotic cell. Because a eukaryotic cell is bigger, it has more of these organelles, these ways of dividing stuff, and so it's able to carry out more functions because of that. And so we get eukaryotes keep evolving, where they're just single-celled, so these would be types of protists. And then eventually we get to 1 to 1.2 billion years ago or so, where what we start to see is the beginning of multicellularity, where eukaryotic cells, not prokaryotes, they're always unicellular, but some of these eukaryotic cells started to kind of work together. And so they formed these organisms where initially everybody was still for themselves, everybody still could do everything they needed, but they'd kind of huddle together and they could benefit each other some. They could do like some sharing, etc. And then eventually it got to the point that they huddled together and became dependent on each other, where they started to say, okay, you do this, I'll do this, and as long as we both do our job, we'll live. And oftentimes we can live more efficiently than if we each tried to live on our own. And so we got multicellularity that arose somewhere around 1 billion years ago, I suppose. And then from there, we'll see that we started to go through and develop into some of the more modern stuff. So around 600 to 800 million years ago, we started to see some of our animals. From there, we went through and we start to see around 500 million years ago or so, we start to see plants. You'll see fungus is kind of somewhere else right around there, until eventually we get to where there's this rapid change where we start to get complex animals, fish and such, then we get amphibians, then we get reptiles, which split off into mammals, birds, modern day reptiles. Dinosaurs obviously died out, but we start to see all the stuff that we're more familiar with today that all kind of happened really mostly in like the last 500 million years. And so if you look at the history of life, you'll see it's a very slow start where it took about 3 billion years just to get to a multicellular basic structure. But then in the last billion years, and really last 500 million years especially, we've started to see things move on land, where now we've got all these terrestrial animals like us. We've got all these plants and this fungus and all these things that live on land now. So that kind of gives you a sense of the history of things, and we see this backed up in the fossil record, so it's a very coherent picture. We don't see where suddenly there's a fish thrown in 3 billion years ago. We don't see a dinosaur with the early fish. Everything fits in beautifully with the dating that we have and with all the evidence we have. And this includes as we've gotten new evidence that didn't even exist at the time when we first came up with this picture. So this is very, very well evidenced, which is why this is what biology universally follows, is this general narrative, this general understanding that this is what the evidence shows us based upon every shred of evidence that we possess. And the biggest piece of that we'll talk about this time, as I said, will be fossils. Now, moving on, just making sure we're comfortable. So we've talked about evolution as change over time. And we've said before that this ultimately is just going to be observations, and in some cases we'll have to make inferences because we can't see certain things that happened a long time ago other than the observations of things like fossils. So there are observations, but we sometimes have to infer kind of what happened in between. So this will be a series of good inferences and solid observations that kind of let us know the history of life. So we can see what evolved into what, at what time, where they were at, all those fun things. And natural selection, to refresh things, will be our explanation. So this is going to be the theory part. This is going to be the part that we're trying to explain what's going on that we see up here. What's going on where we see this change over time in organisms, where they live, what they look like. And so this is going to try and explain that. And natural selection does so, if you remember, by having where certain individuals that have these variations. So just like people are diverse, we have different hair colors, hair types, sizes, facial shapes, body hair amounts, skin tone amounts, different ability to digest various things. So we have this variation. And that allows for nature, as you try and live, as you try and reproduce. We've kind of focused on this idea of survival and sex. So as you try and do those things, certain individuals are naturally selected, which just means that based on nature at that time, based on the environment at that time, they are better able to survive, they're better able to reproduce, and so their version of a variation becomes more common. Because if you have the advantageous version of a variation or a gene that allows you to survive and reproduce better, more of the children in the next generation are from you than from other individuals. And so that means that your genes, which are advantageous, are now more prevalent because they're in your offspring but not the other offspring. And as this occurs over several generations, it allows for traits that are good, and when I say that I mean advantageous for that specific environment, to become more common. And in some cases, if you have a bunch of offspring that are all tall, for instance, you can have where only the tallest of the tall reproduce the next time. So it can help this process to continue. It's not like a one-shot deal. You can get where people keep getting bigger and bigger or smaller and smaller gradually as time goes on if nature selects for it. Which just means that if those individuals that are tall are naturally, just through what else is present, abiotically and biotically, able to survive predators better, catch prey better, avoid negative conditions like temperature, water shortages, whatever the problems are in that specific habitat. If they can cope with all those better, then their particular variation of a gene will become more common. It will become more widespread. And then adaptations are just the term for any change in an organism that makes it better suited to its environment. So this is just what explains why things start to have these traits once again that are better for the environment. So we would say that's an adaptation to have thicker fur if you live more northerly or more southerly, where it ultimately is colder. So if you're towards the actual poles, it's going to make you better able to, generally speaking, we'll say survive, but you can also say be successful, whatever else, in your particular environment. That's the key thing here. And so there's lots of adaptations that we see in organisms throughout things where, polar bears have thick fur, it's ultimately translucent, their skin is very dark, so that way it not only insulates them, but light can then pass through the fur, hit the skin, and heat it up. So it's kind of like in every way possible trying to do everything it can to get them warm. And so that would be an example of an adaptation that works very well for a northerly species that's in the poles. If you move them down to the tropics, that would be a huge, huge detriment because now you're getting too hot because everything's trying to make you trap heat, and heat's not the problem in terms of not enough. Now you've got too much heat, so you've got to figure out ways to get rid of it. So a polar bear would typically do very poorly if you move it too far towards the equator because it's not able to cope with that given its current adaptations. It would have to adapt again to deal with that. But the key thing there is, does it have enough variation to do so? If nobody has the right variation of a characteristic or gene, when something bad happens, if you will, when a shift occurs, then ultimately there's no one to be selected for. Nature can't say, but in nature, none of the individuals will be up to the task, and so none of them would necessarily survive, and if none of them survive, the species just extinct. So this is why some species can go extinct, because it's not something where you can just make what you need. That's not how evolution works. You have to hope that a small number of individuals, because there's always this diversity, there's always some of these individuals usually that have some of these more negative traits. And so when things change, those individuals that have kind of the fringe, not so great traits, they ultimately can now come to the forefront as being the individuals that are coping best. And so now they're surviving way better than they used to. They're reproducing way more than they used to. And so now their genes become more common. So we can get this shift where we kind of went towards one version of things, but now as the environment shifted, we shift back the other way to cope with that. Our next bit is just going to be kind of a little bit about Darwin. So Darwin, just to make sure we're clear on some misconceptions, he was not the person that came up with the idea of evolution. It's not true. Evolution had been around for at least 100 years before Darwin came up with the explanation for it. So as Darwin was looking into this, there had already been multiple people, Lamarck probably being the most notable. He was a French scientist that tried to explain evolution by saying that he believed that you passed on acquired traits. So his famous thing was that if you stretched your neck as a horse, you could eventually become a giraffe, because each generation would be born with a stretched neck and stretch it a bit further. And so that kind of idea was some of the first attempts to explain it. Now that was wrong. You can't really blame him. He was French. But going through, Darwin already knew all this. I mean, this was not things that he had to come up from nowhere. So he knew that these people were trying to explain it. What he did was travel around the world a bit, take a whole bunch of evidence from various different continents, islands near the continents, and he collected fossils, he drew pictures, he had samples. So he was looking at all these organisms, and that's when he got this idea for natural selection and wrote the book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And so he was going through trying to come up with the why he saw the specific things he saw, which in his case, it was that he saw similarities between mainland species and nearby islands. He saw certain similarities between the coasts of certain different continents. He saw many similarities between species that were relatively in the same area on a continent. And so he was wondering kind of why this was when he would go visit a very similar environment somewhere else, and it might have completely different species, even though it's the same basic environment. So there was no reason to have different species. You could have the same species of bird that lives in a similar habitat in Europe be in North America. I didn't actually go visit specifically North America much, or at all. But ultimately, he was looking at that and trying to come up with this idea of why is it that, say, African species versus South American, even though the climate and the general conditions were almost identical, why were they so different? But yet you could have different environments that were relatively nearby, and they had similar species. So this kind of didn't make sense, and so he tried to come up with why it is that we'd see this evolution, how we could explain what we saw. And that was the idea of natural selection, where that there was a mainland species that was kind of diversifying into many other different species as it adapted, got used to different environments, so it could eat different foods, or it could survive different temperatures or different amounts of water. And so that one species could kind of splinter into many, and you saw those species be all similar because they evolved from that one original species. And if you go somewhere new that doesn't have that original species, you can't get versions of that type of bird. So instead, it's whatever bird was there or whatever reptile would typically then diverge. So this island might just have a bunch of iguanas because that's what happened to get there. And so some of the iguanas might diversify and do tasks that normally a gecko would do, a different type of lizard. But because there's no geckos that were there, even though it's the perfect environment, you might see an iguana doing the task that a gecko would normally do because that was what was available. That was what was able to be naturally selected to be able to survive in these various different, in some cases you can say environment, or even what we call a niche, like a little part of the environment. So maybe there's like a bunch of insects, and so seeing there's this abundance of food, it would make sense that any reptile, iguana, whatever, that's capable of eating the insects would have this huge food source, so it'd be pretty successful. And then over time, the ones that are best at doing that breed the most, and so you'd see this gradual adaptation to eating insects. And so this would explain how we can see this diversity of organisms and why we tend to see them clustered and things like that. And the main problem that Darwin had, though, was Darwin was doing this prior to our understanding of genes. The gene idea really came into its own in the early 1900s. And that was when Mendel's work, who was a monk that kind of discovered heredity, he actually did his work in the 1860s, which was back around the time Darwin was doing his stuff. But because no one really looked at Mendel's stuff and took it seriously, no one connected the ideas. And so Darwin always had to kind of struggle with how he could explain how things were able to pass on their traits to their offspring. We had a general idea that things could, because people had been breeding crops and pets to get them to have specific traits. So they knew that you could pass on traits somehow, it seemed, to your offspring, but they didn't get how it worked. And so once they rediscovered Mendel's work in the early 1900s, all this kind of fit together. But during Darwin's time, you'll see that there was a lot of people that doubted him. He didn't really become popular until the early 1900s with Mendel's work because we didn't have this idea of the gene. We couldn't point to exactly who was causing this to explain how these individuals with these good traits, if you will, these advantageous traits, could pass them on to their offspring so they could become more common. And then lastly, just a quick evidence thing. There's way more than this. But just to be clear, we have lots and lots and lots of fossils that all give us the same chronological timeline, the same chronological picture of the history of life. So that's our first concrete set of evidence. The other cool thing is that we did not know about genetics until after we had the idea of evolution. So we already had the idea of evolution and evolution via natural selection, and people had already kind of grouped things how they think this would work. So we already kind of looked at stuff and said, I think this guy evolved from this guy, who evolved from this guy, and we set up these evolutionary pathways. And then along came genetics, which really came into its own in the 1970s, where we could test things and look at their DNA. We could look at their proteins, their genes, and we could compare them. And so we could say if these two organisms are supposed to be closely related, they should have similar genes, similar proteins. And sure enough, that's what we found every time. And so this has given us a huge amount of evidence that there was no way we could know prior to. There's no way we could manipulate, but it's a good way to try and confirm or disprove this idea of evolution, and to some extent then, by proxy, the idea of evolution via natural selection. Now, as scientists, we're still always open if there's new evidence that disproves anything. But in general, at this point, we have so much evidence that there's really not a whole lot of doubt, at least, in most scientists' mind, especially biologists who actually study this. This is the general picture that we have. So until, or if, something ever comes up, we'll gladly listen, etc. But until something else comes up, there's so much evidence, it's pretty ridiculous for a biologist to say that there's some type of flaw. There's just not a weakness or a chink that we've seen, and whenever we've had stuff that people have been concerned about, it's always been taken care of. We've always said, well, I wonder how we ultimately got flagella, and then we found organisms that have step by step, bit by bit, slightly larger components until eventually we get to the flagella. And every smaller piece that's not quite all the pieces of the flagella always has a viable use. And so there's living organisms that have that still use it for that previous use, before it kind of became a flagella, which is essentially a cell tail that's used to move stuff. And so as we see some of these things that really puzzle us, as we've looked for stuff, we've always found the rest of the pieces, so it's always made sense. And so there's tons more than this, and we'll get into that more when we cover the evolution chapters in much more depth. But I wanted you guys to at least have a sense of what evolution is. I want you to at least have some sense that we do have a lot of evidence to support this. We've got one more slide here as we just kind of wrap up with a common misconception, which is humans versus chimps. This is not going to be a battle, so if you're hoping for a wrestling match, that would not be a very good idea and you're going to be disappointed. Just as an aside, the chimp would destroy you. Chimps are about 3 times as strong as the average person, and ultimately they are, I think, meaner than the average person because many of them still ultimately hunt for food, and they do so with their bare hands. So if you have the opportunity to get in a fight with a chimp, you should not do so. I strongly urge that, especially as they like to bite off your extremities, which includes things like your nose, your lips, your fingers, and your genitalia. So I would say that's one that's best to kind of stay out of. But humans and chimps are, and bonobos, which is sometimes called pygmy chimps, are our closest ancestors. But there's a common misconception that people say, all right, we've got apes, first of all, is what they use, and that apes ultimately gave rise to humans, and they think that this is where, like, an ape sitting there gives birth, the mother ape looks at the husband, like, what did you do? And there's, like, this baby crying. That's not how this happened. We are not related to chimps like we're brothers. What ultimately happened is somewhere around, I'll say 5 million years ago, you'll see it's 5, 6, there's some fluctuation as to exactly what you want, but we'll say around 5, that's probably as close as it would have happened. You saw that there was a common ancestor. And what this means is there was this one guy who was fairly ape-like, that was kind of living there in Africa, doing his thing, and there was likely multiple populations, so that just means there's multiple groups living in different areas, and one of those populations or more, it could have been a group of populations, kind of started to evolve in one direction based upon their environment, their food sources, and you had another group that kind of started to evolve separately on their own pathway. So we call that a divergence, the kind of fork in the road, if you will. And so one of these groups from the common ancestor started to go down the pathway that later on, 5 million or more years later, would give rise to chimps and bonobos, right? The other group spent 5 million years gradually diverging and ultimately gave rise to humans as we know them today, Homo sapien. But there was no chimp that ever was tied to humans. There was a common ancestor that was, I guess you could say to some degree, kind of a mix, but even that's not always perfect because you can get new traits that mutate and form along the way. So it's not like that we had to have certain chimp traits because they could have evolved in this 5 million years where they were kind of changing from the common ancestor. But we would have had this more ape-like common ancestor 5 million years ago that we started from. But there is no case of an ape or a chimp or something else like giving birth to a human. That's not how it worked. You just saw where one groups of these ape-like guys became more and more human-like gradually over 5 million years. And I think you guys will talk about it at Cause and Humanities, that this will happen gradually, and we see multiple fossils that show us this gradual transition, going bipedal, getting a larger cranial size, and then we see a separate transition where some of those ape-like guys became a little bit more chimp or bonobo-like over those 5 million years. So this is the process. Now we do see that we're still very similar. Depending on which evidence you look at, we're somewhere between probably 95 and 99%, depending on what statistic and what test they used, identical genetically to chimps, to bonobos. So we are still very, very alike them. Now keep in mind that that difference, even though it seems relatively small, can still be hundreds to, in some cases, perhaps thousands of genes. And so we can still have appreciable differences. It's not like that means that we're identical. It just means we have a lot of similarities. And a lot of our similarities are basic things like chemical reactions that occur in our body. They don't have to be things like skin tone or hair type. It doesn't mean we have to have just hair coming all over our body or something like chimps. We do have significant differences, but we also have way more in common than we have that's different. And so you can see there is still this kinship, and if you go further back and further back to different types of apes, you'll see that the number as far as how identical we are will gradually start to get less and less. And so if you look at us and a dog or something, it's probably somewhere in the 80s. If you go look at like a frog or something, it's probably going to be still a fair amount shared, but probably more like the low 70s, I think, or high 60s. I'm kind of making these up a bit. But I could try to pull up a chart for you guys later, and you can look this up too. The data's there. The idea is that it just gradually gets less and less, to where you will still share an appreciable chunk. I'm not sure what it'd be if it's 30, 40, 50% of your genes would still be similar to that of a plant. But the whole point is that we still have similarities to, especially plants, animals, these multicellular eukaryotes. We still have some genes, we still have DNA sequences in common with them, even though we've split most likely a long time ago. The last time we had a common ancestor could have been hundreds of millions of years ago. If you're looking at some protists, it could potentially have been a billion or more years ago. But we still have some stuff in common that's kind of came along as this baggage. But along the way, too, we've had plenty of stuff that changes, and even small changes can have big effects. Even one changed protein can be enough to kill you. And so you can see that even small changes can be significant in terms of what you look like and what you're capable of doing. And that allows us to get to the diversity of life we have today, and that allows us to get to humans from ultimately what may have been the first prokaryotic simple cell 4 billion years ago that lived. I hope you've enjoyed this, and have a good night.